Sometimes I like to just look through old Batman comics just to see what kind of weird stuff I can find, weird forgotten characters and stories. Sometimes I do this to find material for videos, and sometimes I just do it for fun. Anyway, I was doing this the other day. I was specifically looking through old issues of Batman and Detective Comics from the 50s. And I happened to stumble upon two stories that I found rather interesting. Two Batman stories that I had never, ever heard of before in my entire life. It features two characters, two rogues, that I also have, of course, never heard of in my entire life. These two stories and these two villains have really nothing to do with each other whatsoever. I simply decided to lump them together here in this one video because they couldn't really hold a video on their own. Their only appearances are their first appearances. They never appeared ever again in anything. So there's just not much material to work with. We do have a bit of a theme or gimmick or whatever you want to call it going on here though, because one of these characters is actually quite crappy while the other is pretty good. So it's one crappy forgotten Batman villain and one good forgotten Batman villain. Anyway, let's stop beating around the bush and just get to the subject at hand. I will first present to you the crappy Batman villain. Let's get that crap out of the way first. And the villain in question is Mr. Hydro. He made his first and only appearance in Batman number 73, published in 1952. His one sole story was titled The Water Crimes of Mr. Hydro, and it was written by Bill Finger and penciled by Lou Sayer Schwartz. That's right, we've got a water-themed villain here for Batman. So the story begins with a baseball game being played in Gotham State Penitentiary by the convicts. And there we're introduced to Timothy Flagg, the water boy. And yes, this is indeed our Mr. Hydro. He's a puny, pathetic little water boy. Flagg begs one of the other prisoners to take him along on a planned breakout, but he refuses because he doesn't want a pathetic little water boy along. He then proceeds to drench the water boy in his own water, and all the inmates mock and laugh at him. They mock him for not being capable of being anything else than a water boy, and apparently he's been a water boy his entire life. Not really sure why he's in prison if all he's ever been was a water boy. They never specify what crime he committed. That night, Timothy Flagg cries in his bed in his cell and vows to show 'em all. He's come up with a brilliant scheme to use water to show everyone what a big man he is, and that water can actually be useful in a lot of different ways. Meanwhile, the other prisoners' breakout plan completely fails and they all end up dead. But that doesn't matter, because Timothy Flagg has his own breakout plan now. He's gonna use water to escape the prison. He manages to get a job as the repairman of the prison water tower, but instead of repairing the tower, he weakens it. Weakens it so much that it falls over during a high wind. And Timothy is on top of it and uses the water to be flushed over onto the other side of the wall. Thus, he made his prison escape using water. Timothy then decides to show the entire world what a big man he is, and all the amazing things you can use water for. So he becomes a water-themed supervillain, dubbing himself Mr. Hydro. And somehow he manages to convince a bunch of other crooks that this is a great idea to use water to commit crimes, and to join his gang. Thus, Mr. Hydro and his wet bandits go on a string of water-themed crimes across Gotham City, naturally running into Batman and Robin along the way. The incredible Mr. Hydro eventually decides that he must get rid of the pesky dynamic duo, and naturally he plans to do it by water. Apparently, it's common knowledge that there's a river running through the Batcave. For some reason, Bruce has let this slip, and Mr. Hydro is gonna use this river to get access to the Batcave and blow it up. Naturally, he fails and is captured by Batman and Robin and sent back to prison. And that's the last we ever saw of the aquatic Mr. Hydro. So, this comic kinda sounds like an alternate version of the Adam Sandler movie The Waterboy. This is the version where instead of becoming a football player, he became a supervillain. I mean, they're almost identical. He even kinda looks like Adam Sandler. Now, having a water-themed villain in a Batman Rogues Gallery, a crook who commits water-themed crimes, is not the worst idea. I mean, why not? Why not have a water-themed rogue? But this is clearly not the way to do it. I mean, just his origin story of being a pathetic, puny water boy who wants to prove to the world what awesome things you can do with water. It's it's just no. No! That's so dumb. Even for 1950s standards, that is so stupid. And his water crimes are pretty damn stupid too. Like for instance one of his crimes where he's robbing a guy high up on a skyscraper, and the only really water theme going on here is the fact that he's gonna escape by jumping out of the building down into a kid-sized swimming pool. Which he does and somehow survives, because 1950s comic book logic. But even for 1950s comic books, that is pretty goddamn stupid. And let's not even get into his visual design. That costume, did he really need to dress up like that? Is that the best he could think of? Yeah, Mr. Hydro is a pretty terrible character, but I definitely think that he can be salvaged. You just have to completely recreate him, and essentially just keep the name and the water gimmick. Moving on to the next one, the rogue that's actually good. And the rogue in question is Barney Barrows, aka the Mental Giant. He made his first and only appearance in Detective Comics 217, published in 1955. The tale was titled The Mental Giant of Gotham City and was written by Edmund Hamilton and penciled by Dick Sprang. In the story we're introduced to Barney Barrows, a kid who really hates criminals because criminals killed his brother. His lifelong ambition is thus to become a police officer so he can fight criminals. Years later, as an adult, he tries but fails. He was unable to pass the mental examinations. In other words, Barney is too dim-witted to be allowed to become a police officer. The best they can offer him is the position of janitor at a police station. And Barney takes it. Apparently though, Barney is too dim-witted to be a janitor too. One night, while mopping away in the police laboratory, he accidentally messes around with a big X-ray machine. And as a result, his head is exposed to powerful X-rays. Naturally, because it's 1950s comic books, his head begins to mutate and grows super large, as does his brain. And the dim-witted Barney is now super intelligent. And what does Barney use his newfound intellect for? For crime? For evil? Well, obviously not, as he hates criminals. No, he naturally decides to use it to fight crime, as he's always wanted. Barney is so smart, he's easily able to deduce Batman and Robin's true identities as Bruce Wayne and Dick Grayson. He then uses this information to essentially blackmail Bruce and Dick into becoming his minions. You gotta remember that Barney is not physically strong, so he still needs henchmen to do all the physical stuff. So with his two reluctant lackeys in tow, Barney goes on a crusade against crime in Gotham City. It soon becomes apparent to Batman and Robin that their new boss is a bit too fanatical for their tastes. Barney uses rather extreme methods in his war on crime. For instance, when questioning a criminal for information, he does so with a torture machine of his own invention. Naturally something Batman and Robin would oppose to. And later, after having figured out a gang of robbers' next target, he lays a trap for them. An electric trap, again built by himself, that will fry them to death. Naturally also something that the dynamic duo would be a bit opposed to. Obviously, Batman and Robin can't continue working for this guy. They gotta get rid of him. But of course they can't, because if they try anything, he will reveal their secret identities to the entire world. Fortunately for Batman and Robin, the problem kinda solves itself when the radiation effects on Barney begins to wear off, and his head and brain grows back to normal size. And he once again becomes the dim-witted Barney Barrows. And he also doesn't remember anything that happened during his reign as the mental giant of Gotham City, including the true identities of Batman and Robin. Yeah, kind of a cop-out ending there, but what are you gonna do? What an unusually interesting and complex villain for a 1950s Batman comic. I mean, just look at his motivations. He's fanatically fighting criminals. That's really unlike anything we've ever seen in a Batman comic from the period. The villains back then were just guys after money and power. They didn't have interesting motivations like this. I mean, this giant-headed character is essentially a dark mirror reflection of Batman himself. He's a sort of Batman gone wrong situation. They have the same motivations, the same origin story. They both lost loved ones to criminals and thus decided to fight crime. You just didn't really get villains like this back in those days, so this character is an anomaly. I don't understand how he exists. Now, of course, the whole deal with Barney Barrows, the dim-witted fool who can barely even be a janitor, all of that is kind of silly, and that's typical of the time. I'm not really a huge fan of that, but everything else about this character and this story is just amazing. And I love his visual design too, this guy with a giant head, and this character predates the more famous giant-headed DC villain Hector Hammond by several years. And so there you have it. One crappy forgotten Batman villain and one good forgotten Batman villain. Let me know down in the comments what you thought of these two rogues. And of course, as always, remember, Arkham Asylum awaits you in the next video.